Good evening and welcome back at IMPAKT TV. My name is Rosa Wevers and I'm sitting next to our special guest, Ross Exo Adams. Welcome, Ross.
Thank you.
Ross is an assistant professor and co-director of the architecture program at Bard College in New York. He's also the author of Circulation and Urbanization, which was published in 2019 with Sage. And he works more broadly on the intersections of architecture and urbanism with political geography and environmental humanities. Ross, thank you so much for being here. You've had a very busy day, I believe.
Yeah.
How are you enjoying the festival so far?
It's really wonderful. I think it's bringing a lot of questions that are relevant to my own work, obviously, but bringing together a number of people into conversations that I think I wouldn't have had the chance to be in otherwise. It's been wonderful.
Any particular highlights or something that stood out?
Well, so far, I think actually the bar has been really a highlight, just meeting everyone and having casual conversations. Obviously, the program is just chock full of amazing things, so many nice pieces of art, great keynotes, and so on. Unfortunately, I've not been able to see everything, obviously, but it's been really lovely.
And the good thing is that everything will also be visible online later.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always a possibility to watch it. All right, so your work takes a rather interdisciplinary approach to topics of the urbanization. Could you briefly introduce to maybe people who haven't seen the keynote yet, what your work focuses on, and also what is your approach into this topic of the urban?
Yeah, well, I think my work really sits somewhere between the fields of architecture and geography, if I'm going to be sort of specific. And I think my work has been informed by kind of the strengths and lackings, let's say, of each discipline and the way that these disciplines sort of structure a form of production of knowledge. In geography is a very lively field of inquiry and criticism of urban studies and of the urban that I've drawn a lot of inspiration from. Its focus is very much on the present and conditions that we can look at in the world and sort of pick apart, and also drawing from history and so forth. Architecture, on the other hand, is sort of where I kind of find my home in a way. But it's a field that's obviously much more future-oriented, right? We create buildings and spaces that don't yet exist. And in combination with that, let's say architectural history lives very much, in my mind, in the past. And so I sort of struggle to situate myself within all these spaces because I think what's needed from my standpoint is a set of new ways of understanding our world in general. And so for me, the urban is a kind of large, let's say, entry point into that question, but one that I think hasn't yet completely been explored, at least from these various disciplines. So historians tend to not want to theorize things, historians of architecture. So it seems that the kind of work of, the past has been fixed, and it's just a matter of kind of exploring things that have not yet been brought to light. Geographers, again, tend to be more present focused and looking at kind of problems in the here and now. And so my work is really about bringing a new history out that's very much informed by a critical and theoretical, let's say, framework. That basically argues that the urban is a kind of space that is new to the world and that hasn't really been properly theorized and understood as such. It's taken to be just, the growth of the city that's been there forever, and that sort of naturalizes a process that I think isn't necessarily, written into like human genetics of like things we do. But is rather tied to questions of territory, is tied to questions of capital, and it's tied to questions of government. So that, for me, is, I guess, the basis on which my book sort of starts a questioning of the urban.
So in relation to that, the festival theme is the curse of smooth operations. What would be a smooth operation in the urban that you think we should look at more critically?
Well, the sort of endless growth that we take to be just a kind of given quality of I guess, the way we inhabit the planet is one of those smooth operations. I think, cities are full of incongruencies and disruptions and so on. But I think in the background, they continue to kind of create a smoothness for certain relationships that we take, again, to be sort of normal or natural. Things like private property, things like circulation, things like, again, endless growth, all kind of underwrite a way we kind of continue to inhabit a certain way of being without necessarily questioning it. So rather than thinking about the disruptions contra the kind of smooth operations of a city, I guess it's more for me the ways in which we naturalize and smooth out our own kind of understandings of the world that things like the urban help to institute.
I think one of the moments in which such a disruption of the smooth operation became very apparent to also people who are not theorizing this so much is during the lockdowns, during COVID. I don't know how it was in the US, but in the Netherlands you saw, for example, that a lot of people started realizing who were living in big cities, like, hey, I live in this very small apartment and now I cannot leave it anymore. And I have to work here, I have to sleep here, I have to live here, I have to relax, I have to exercise. And it was sort of a renewed realization of the importance of having space. And as a result, also some people started moving more to rural areas, also with the consequence of the housing prices there going up. A lot of different political complexities were happening at the same time. Well, how do you look at this kind of development? What can it tell us?
Well, it's interesting. So just at the beginning of the pandemic, where I live, I happened to move into faculty housing on campus, the college I teach at. And the house that I moved into is tiny. It's I can't jump in the house, literally. So I had to navigate that. But it's also in an area that is sort of north of New York City, and the Hudson Valley. It's this quite beautiful region. And it's sort of, for a long time, been a place for wealthy people from the city to come for vacation or to have a second or third or fourth home. And so, as with after 9/11, as far as I understand, there was a huge sort of exodus of those with means to the area, and housing prices went crazy. And the same thing happened during COVID. A lot of people left the city, temporarily, but then it became permanent, or vice versa. So I've been in a rural area, and it's been nice in a way, all things considered. That said, I think a lot of that for me was based on having, living and teaching on a campus that didn't totally shut down. So we were teaching outside in tents throughout a lot of this period, which actually I thought was a wonderful thing. It made me realize how teaching and is a very private thing, right? You go into a classroom and close the door, and no one but the participants and the professor, gets to sort of experience that. And suddenly, if you walk around on a campus like ours with tents, when we had them, it was really a nice experience of like hearing this sort of, these rituals almost of teaching and learning also, what people are up to. So I think, I consider myself quite lucky in the whole scheme of things.
In your book, you combine the notion of urbanization or urbanism with this idea of circularity or circulation, I must say. Yeah. Could you define a little bit more what that notion gives us in thinking about the urban?
Yeah. So the book is really a kind of political history of circulation. Or maybe we can say a spatio-political history of circulation. And the reason why I ended up taking that as a kind of key concept is because as you start to, or let's say according to kind of canonical histories of urbanism and so forth, modern urbanism, there's this assumption that sometime in the 19th century, circulation suddenly mattered, and it, was discovered, thanks to biology and sort of economic theories, to be a central way of organizing life, and therefore cities had to, get new roads and everything like this. But what's interesting is if you start to look at the concept a little bit, you realize that it's not completely new at all. And in fact, the notion was first coined in the 15th century, I believe. And in fact, when you start to look at the history of circulation, you see that it really informs, at least within a kind of Western framework, it informs the ways in which states, political formations, trade networks, and other sort of centers of power, how they begin to organize themselves or begin to kind of create power blocks and so on. So circulation kind of operates as a hinge between understanding how space and power are restructured throughout history. And this also then brings into the question the body, which is another story altogether. But for me, it was a really interesting way to kind of break the kind of hegemonic notions or assumptions, really, that modernism should be known by the kind of newness of certain ideas in the 20th century that help to kind of support the typical art historical periodization of history, the Baroque and this and that, then the modern arrives and everything else goes away. I was more interested in seeing the kind of continuities that cut across those boundaries, and circulation was something that helped me do that.
And so looking into the future, how is that developing? Like, what does the notion give us to
today
think about that? Yeah.
Well, obviously the circulation of data becomes a really crucial lens, let's say, to think about things like smart cities and data extractivism, resilience, and so on. And that's something that I'm working on still. But I think for me, when we talk about future, I mean, I guess I can talk about my future work on one lens, but I think what's interesting for me about, coming back to this sort of discursive understanding, architecture is always a future-oriented practice by definition, yet the things that we tend to produce are often just ways of reproducing and repackaging, systems and ways of being, let's say, that exist or have existed. And I think, for me, questions like the way that we're trying to think about architecture at BARD differently is by using a more kind of imaginative sense and scope of futures through fiction writing and letting that guide a sort of architectural sensibility or urban sensibility. So I know I'm deviating from your question a little bit, but you mentioned futures, so yeah. I'm going with it.
Yeah, but I'm also thinking, because architecture, of course, is not only about constructing buildings, building right. cities, but also in a way shaping ways of living, right? Yes. To what extent, from where you're at, from your expertise, do you think that these huge crises that we're facing now, housing crisis, the climate crisis, to name a few amongst all them, are incorporated or maybe even ignored in these kind of designs?
I think they tend to be ignored. I think architects are very good at problem solving. They tend to treat their projects or their briefs, let's say, as problems to solve. So we see a lot of projects that or proposals that aim to kind of make everyone happy and do all the right things and so on. And I think I've described it before as a kind of dangerous innocence that architects tend not to want to take a position and tend not to want to get kind of dirtied into the politics of a given issue, and rather staying at a kind of neutral stance with regard to something like housing crisis. So if there's a housing crisis, well, we'll build more houses, right? Yeah. And in a way, I think architecture is inevitably so tied in with finance, with real estate, with governance, and so on. It's a wonder to me why we don't have a kind of more direct, let's say, sort of relationship through criticality to those structures, and instead we sort of are at the end of that and jump in. We tend to be at the end of that and jump in with our solutions without realizing that often they're making things worse.
Something, or a place in which I think this becomes very concrete is these renders, I
Yes.
think they are called, right? So these are, could you give a good definition, short definition of a render?
The rendering is like where all the money is in architecture. And I think, I think architects tend to have a fraught relationship with renderings. I think we tend not to like them because we know we're sort of tied to them. We have to make these renderings because that's how we sell projects.
Just for the audience, maybe if people don't know what renderings are, could
photorealistic, imagery that are constructed, through computer models and lots of Photoshop.
So, for example, people based in Utrecht, there have been a lot of renderings of what the new station area will look like. So it's these imaginations. Visualized ideas of buildings. But I think what very much strikes me in that is always how there seems to be no pollution, no waste, no homeless people. It's this very like still sort of way of living.
Perpetual summer, every day is beautiful.
Always beautiful weather.
Yeah, I think it's really striking how, especially images that we produce these days, that are specifically geared to or bound to projects that are trying to resolve issues of climate change, they tend to make it look like climate change will go away, which of course implies that the project is going to like single-handedly eliminate climate change. It's a sort of, there's an economy obviously with these images, but it's one that I think we don't try to push back against enough. And I feel like there's a certain inevitability. We have to make the images, otherwise no investors will come and so on.
And do you think it will be possible to do it in a more critical manner?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I do with my students in a class that I taught recently was, actually not architects. I gave them a bunch of recent images, specifically coming from like resilience projects that often show a lot of people like happily kind of stewarding a kind of landscape and enjoying themselves and so on. And a lot of times these projects tend to be in communities that are impoverished or disadvantaged in one way or another. They're frontline in terms of climate effects. And the images that are produced that sort of depict everyone sort of happily like stewarding the landscape, I sort of argue that they're kind of fictions in themselves. Like that, there's no way that people who are working 3 jobs are going to like go out and take care of a landscape or something. And so I asked my students to write the fictional narrative that moves us to this position where this kind of society can actually happen, and how to sort of conceive these really banal renderings as actually radical projections of a kind of post-capitalist world. And that's been a lot of fun, just hearing how people sort of imagine a different world. And from that point, then I think we can ask different questions of what architecture can do in those kind of imaginaries.
Yes. Well, on that note, we came already to the end. We have come to the end of this interview. Thank you so much, Ross, for joining me.
Thank you very much.
On this quite late hour. And, well, please enjoy the rest of the festival.